So I'm Jason Lilley from UMaine Extension. I'm based in Cumberland County. I support farmers in Cumberland, Androscoggin, and Saginaw counties, and really focused on cover cropping and soil health, mostly in vegetable systems, but definitely cross over into various production systems. B. Chim is here as our state potato agronomist, and B is doing some cover crop work as well, and she's going to help with the just monitoring the chat and some of the logistics here tonight. I do want to acknowledge that there are several funders that have made these programs possible. So the Natural Resources Conservation Service has offered some funding for some programming related to soil health for the UMaine Extension team, so NRCS. And then we have a specialty crop block grant through the state of Maine, also doing some soil health work and outreach. So as we go through today, there's quite a few folks on the call, but definitely feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions. But we might kind of lean into the chat button on the Zoom function. So if you have any clarifying questions as we go along, feel free to type those into the chat, and B will chip in with those as we go along. And then I'm going to try to leave a good chunk of time at the end so that we can have some conversation and some questions. Okay, so the plan for this session, going to talk a little bit about kind of setting cover crop goals, and just briefly about the diversity of goals that we can get from planting a cover crop, and then narrow in on those goals that can be achieved that are relevant to our nutrient management and fertility programs. And then we'll walk step by step and talk about different aspects of fertility management with cover crops, including enhancing soil nutrients and soil nutrient holding capacity, capturing nutrients, so as opposed to letting those nutrients just wash away over winter, holding on to them to carry over the winter, fixing nitrogen, and then nutrient tie-up and release rates with different cover crop management strategies. And then we'll throw out a couple of species selections that can work well for kind of achieving the majority of these benefits. So when we have soils like this, folks want to unmute themselves or type into the chat. What are some detriments that might come from having your soils looking like this for too long of a period of time?
Erosion.
Erosion. So there's no roots. So whether that's wind erosion or water-based erosion, absolutely.
There's nothing to hold the soil moisture.
Yeah, so the sun's just beating right on that soil surface, so we're going to lose quite a bit of moisture that way.
Loss of carbon content.
Could have loss of carbon content, like if the soil itself is washing away, there's carbon with that, and also that sun just beating down is killing some of the microbial life. So yeah, there's all sorts of detriment to having our soil bare and exposed. So weed reproduction, there's nothing to outcompete with those weed seeds that are there. So you see all these guys in the back that could potentially set seeds and cause future problems. Soil structure, so right along with the carbon loss, as those raindrops are pounding on the bare soil, we're breaking apart those soil aggregates. And a big one is that as we're experiencing that erosion, not only is it soil particles, but it's also nutrients and potentially pesticide residues that are washing away with those soil particles. And we know from the history that if we leave our soils bare for too long and we spend more time degrading than building them up, there's the likelihood that they'll seek their revenge. So we had multiple dust bowls in like 1910 and then the 1930s that were just a result of excessive use of kind of steel and plows and pretty abusive tires. Look at these steel tires just causing compaction. And then that was all compounded with a drought and massive windstorms that caused to a lot of loss. So we're trying to avoid that, of course. But that was 90 years ago, but we aren't free. We haven't solved all of our soil-based problems, especially related to agriculture. So in Lake Champlain, there's some pretty serious issues occurring related to phosphorus loss. So there's over application of manures and fertilizers, and without the use of cover crops and soil coverage to capture those nutrients, there's a high likelihood that they will and they are washing out of those fields into the watersheds and then concentrating in the lakes, and that is causing algal blooms, which then result in loss of oxygen and just loss of overall life in those waterways. So we don't want to be responsible for that. Here in Maine, we're not as far down this path when we look at Casco Bay, Penobscot Bay, all of our kind of watersheds, but there is the potential for that to happen, and we want to try to avoid that. And I know there's a lot of folks on the call from out of state that may be closer and having more experiences with these. So that the causes of that phosphorus, there are many. As far as the phosphorus is reaching Lake Champlain, just generally there's nutrients in the soil. So as the riverbank falls apart, that can add phosphorus loading. Sewage treatment plants are a small percentage, but still very important. Developed and kind of impervious surfaces and lands. But we see that agriculture really takes the biggest chunk of this. So we want to be doing what we can as stewards to minimize the amount of our contribution to this problem. So there's a bunch listed here, but if folks want to shout out or type into the chat, if you have experience with cover cropping, what are the primary goals that you're looking to achieve through that practice? So we got one that's looking for weed control and nutrient management, reducing weed seed bank,
organic matter,
adding organic matter to the soil and improving soil health, moisture retention. So we just came out of 2.5 years of like a drought here in Maine. And then we turned around and we went right into just completely saturated the soggy soils. So improving the soil health and improving moisture retention is also going to help with percolation, infiltration of water, feeding soil biology, and erosion potential and prevention. So yeah, all good stuff and all things that we can achieve through planting cover crops. And the really cool thing about cover crops is that we don't have to settle for only one benefit. So most of our species of cover crops can achieve several different benefits, and depending on how we manage those and maybe what species we mix together, we can have not only the benefits of suppressing weeds and holding soil over winter, but we can also have all of these nutrient management benefits. So some of those benefits include improving soil organic matter, which is good for nutrient retention, increasing soil aggregation, penetrating plow pans, nitrogen scavenging, nitrogen fixation is the one that most people think about. But just preventing erosion and reducing surface compaction. So all of these are relevant and important for good nutrient management in our systems. I'll talk about this tool again towards the end of the talk, but this is from the Northeast Cover Crop Council. Myself and a few other folks on the call are board members of the Northeast Cover Crop Council, and we have this, what I think is a really cool tool to plug in your goals, plug in your soil type and your hardiness zone where you're located, and it will spit out cover crop species that are best suited, like in a ranking, but they're best suited to achieve the top 3 goals that you select. So we can look at that later on in the talk. Okay, so going to get a little kind of further into it here. So this is a UMaine Soil Analytical Lab standard soil test. So do you notice any of our like major nutrients that are missing here? B knows.
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen. B, why don't we test for nitrogen in standard soil test?
I have this conversation as well.
In one sentence. So
We're working on it.
right. So so nitrogen is not included in our standard soil test. And there is a pretty important reason for that. And that is summed up in this very clear little diagram. And this is intentionally, I put this up there to show you how complex the nitrogen cycle is. So as nitrogen is in our soils, it can show up and it can be removed in many, many different ways, and it can be present in many different forms. Just looking at the ways that it can be removed, there's erosion. So it can, as soil particles wash away, it can bind to the water and bind to those soil particles, and it gets lost to the waterway. Denitrification is when we have saturated soils. The form of nitrogen that's in the soil changes and it goes to gaseous ammonia, and it gases off. It just goes to the environment and we lose it. Volatilization. So if we spread manure on the soil surface, if we don't get that manure incorporated within hours, we can start to lose nitrogen to the environment and to the atmosphere. And then leaching is the process of nitrate binding to water molecules and then being pulled down below the root zone and often into groundwater. So if we're spending a lot of money to buy nitrogen fertilizers or to grow legume cover crops, and then not aligning that with our crop needs, we're going to have a lot of loss. And not only is that an environmental concern, but it is a big, it's a big financial hit to the farm as well. And it could be a yield hit too, because we thought that we had the right amount of fertility down, but that actually ended up not being available to the crop. It's also a pretty big climate change concern, because the impact of 1 pound of nitrous oxide is 265 times more detrimentally impactful to the greenhouse gases than 1 pound of carbon dioxide. So we really want to make sure that we're utilizing all that nitrogen and being careful about how we manage it. So the first step of fertility management is to not lose the nutrients that you already have. You've already paid for them. You've already got them in the soil from last year. whatever that may be. We're trying to keep them in our system and have them not leaving through all those various outlets. So having just any form of living roots. So anytime that we can have cover crops and living roots in the soils, especially going into the winter time, that's going to reduce the impact of precipitation. So those raindrops kind of have a little padding zone to land on. It's going to stop or at least slow the lateral movement of water that's going to cause like sheet erosion. And those roots are going to enhance the creation of macropores, which allows water to infiltrate versus sheeting across the surface. And as we already discussed, as water is sheeting across the surface, it's taking those nutrients and soil sediment with it. So nitrogen is a major concern. And we also kind of already talked about with Lake Champlain that phosphorus is another major concern about how it leaves. Luckily, the phosphorus is a bit more simple in how it moves. That's lucky for us as far as our understanding anyway. But it doesn't gas off. It's much less likely to leach down through the soil profile, but it is highly likely to be bound to soil particles and to wash off with heavy rainfall and with erosion. So that's just a concern and something to keep in mind. But again, if we have living roots in the soil, they're not only causing these benefits of slowing that water down, but they're living plants. They need nutrients to survive, so they're taking those nutrients up into their bodies, into the plants, and kind of storing them there in a safe until we reincorporate those into the soil. So remember that earlier picture of those bare soils, and this is what we hopefully want to take that towards. Not only lots of roots, lots of soil coverage, very little like exposed soil, but a lot of diversity of types of roots, and not a lot, just a handful of little ragweed, weed species in here. So we mentioned how the roots can penetrate down through and create macropores. So, each of these little roots that have gone down, when they die or decay or get pulled, they're going to leave channels that's really easy for water to penetrate down through. Additionally, as they're growing, they're opening up their little stomates in their roots, and they're taking in nutrients and water. And as they're doing that, they're leaking out a little bit of sugars that they've made through photosynthesis. So it's kind of this exchange, and the leaking out of those sugars creates a feeding frenzy for microbes, and all those little fungi and little good guys in the soil, they feed on that, and they help to glue the individual soil particles together to make better soil aggregates. So you can see all these kind of like pea-shaped little globs along the roots, and those are helping with our soil aggregation. So we've got our macropores where water can run down through, and then our micropores, which are actually magnetically charged, so they can hold on to nutrients through a positive negative charge there. So the soils are negatively charged, and a lot of our nutrients are positively charged. Okay, soil chemistry. So everybody getting their textbooks back out. So this is a cation exchange capacity, everybody's favorite topic. So cation exchange capacity is the idea that different soils have different abilities to hold on to nutrients. And just like I was just talking about, some soils will have a lot of these negative charge sites for our cations to stick onto, and some of them will have much fewer. So a sandy soil that has been kind of abused, or sometimes just been managed, especially like vegetable production where there's a lot of tillage, it's very hard to build up organic matter in a sandy soil. And so this mill equivalent, so this unit right here is essentially just how many exchange sites are in those types of soils. So sandy soils do not have the ability to hold on to nutrients very well. So in this scenario, you may have heard that it's best to do split applications, put half of your fertilizer on early, half of it later, because if not, a lot of that will just leach down through. If you have loams or silt loams, it's kind of in this middle range, so doing a little bit better to hold on to nutrients. Clays do almost too good to hold on to the nutrients. But organic matter is significantly higher and significantly more able to hold on to those nutrients in a way that slowly releases those to the plants. So the higher organic matter, the more ability that we have to hold on to nutrients and slowly feed those to the plants, and to not have so much like just loss to leaching. So the cover crops are adding organic matter, compost adds organic matter. Anytime that we can improve that overall soil health, we're going to have a better ability to just slowly provide for the plants what they need, and to not lose those nutrients that we already have. Make sense? So kind of the general idea of enhancing soil quality and soil carbon and soil organic matter is focused on that whole process increases the water stable soil aggregation. So that's soil aggregates that are stable against water breaking them apart. So that earlier cover crop that we showed, those roots, those are likely these little globs of aggregates are probably pretty resilient against the impact of water hitting those to break them apart. Again, we have macro and micro pore space. There's carbon contribution for increased organic matter, and as a result, that increases our carbon exchange or cation exchange capacity. So some cover crop species that can help you achieve that are winter rye, sorghum Sudan, and millet. So these are really high biomass cover crops. They grow a lot. They can be pretty difficult to incorporate into the soil, but that's because there's so much material that's going to go down and feed the soils. So I'm not saying that I would recommend folks to just only plant these, but if this is your primary goal to just enhance soil quality and just this ability to hold on to nutrients, these are some good options for that. Okay, so the next is the concept of nutrient scavenging and nutrient capture. So in this one study, their manure was applied to fields, and in the control where they did not apply manure, they had 10 to 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre that were picked up by the cover crops. So they tested for the nitrogen in the cover crop itself. And then cover crops that were grown on fields that had been manured in the fall, they had 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre captured in the plant material. So because we showed that nitrogen cycle diagram, because the nitrogen can move around so readily, if the cover crops hadn't absorbed those, then that could have been just lost to the environment. So you could have gone out and spread your manure in the fall time, thinking it was going to add nutrients in the spring, but in reality, we likely would have lost a lot of those nutrients. So having cover crops out there, whether it was with manure or without, was hugely beneficial to capture those nutrients and then carry them over for the next season. And some cover crop species that are really good at grabbing onto those nutrients are winter rye and a lot of our grass species. Tillage radish is really good. The downside of tillage radish is that it winter kills. And if anybody's grown it in the past, when you go out to look at that field of tillage radish in the springtime, it's just a field of like ghost webbing. Like there's essentially nothing left out there except for holes in the ground. So while it does pick up a lot of nutrients early, it would release those by the springtime, and then with our spring rains, it would allow those to be lost. So tillage radish during the growing season is good for this. Over winter, do you want to pair it with another grass? So that when the tillage radish dies, the grass could pick up what it's releasing. And then alfalfa has really deep roots, so it's able to go down and take nutrients from down deep that have been leached beyond our normal, the depth of our usual crop roots. The alfalfa pulls those nutrients back up and recycles them so that the next crop can actually have access to those nutrients that were lost. Okay, in this trial, Sundemeyer, they were able to, let's see, they were looking at soil nitrate in fields that they had manured, and they put that manure down probably in September and then went back right before the ground froze up in November and tested the soil for nitrate in fields that they had oilseed radish, also called tillage radish, and in fields without that. So again, they're just testing the soil here. With that, we can see where there was no tillage radish cover crop, we were consistently about we had an 80% decline in soil nitrogen where the cover crop was planted. So that means that the tillage radish is taking up 80% of the nitrogen that's in the field, and it's holding that and going to carry it over for some period of time versus just letting it hang out in the soil and potentially leach away. Now, of course, if you go out and you plant a cover crop at the end of October, especially something like tillage radish or oats that are going to winter kill anyway, they're barely going to germinate. So they're not going to have the root mass to go down deep and find these nutrients. So this study showed that winter rye actually was able to take up a lot more, actually reduce nitrate leaching the earlier it was planted. And of course, the earlier it was planted, the larger it was able to get in the fall time before it went dormant. So while it is beneficial to put winter rye down as late as you can and just have it, even if it's mostly just seed, it will germinate in the springtime. That's beneficial for soil coverage, soil erosion control, but the earlier that you can get these on, the more benefit you're going to have as far as the nutrient scavenging and the nutrient capture aspects. So when we're trying to maximize that nutrient capture process, we want to maximize the biomass and try to get that cover crop seed down as early as possible. I know that's tough with a lot of our vegetable crops and a lot of our other, corn silage. It can be, late when we get those harvested and taken off. So I'm actually working on a project where we're interseeding, we're putting our cover crop over the cash crop so that it can get more growth going into the fall. And we're doing that in late season sweet corn and in really late like storage cabbage fields, and seeing pretty good results. We want to mix those overwintered and the winter killed species. So as something like a tillage radish dies in midwinter, that maybe the winter rye roots that are there, they can take up all those nutrients that the tillage radish is releasing. And then just keep in mind that when the cover crop is terminated and incorporated in the springtime, you can really take credit for that in your fertilizer plan, your fertility plan. So there are many trials that have shown that 80% of the nutrients that you put down in the fall time can be carried over into the springtime as long as you're using the right types of cover crops and terminating them at the right time. So if folks haven't seen or don't have a copy of Managing Cover Crops Profitably in your back pocket most of the time, like I do, this might be a good book to pick up. You can get this as a free PDF, but I really like having the hard copy because there's some really good tables in there. And this is the table kind of specifically on legumes and nitrogen. And we see these rankings. So if the circle is all black, that means that species excels in that area, does really good. And if it's all white, that means that it doesn't do so good. So we see as far as this cluster of legumes, they're all pretty good at being a nitrogen source. And what they're doing is they're taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in the soil, they're able to convert that atmospheric nitrogen into little granulars that act just like granulars of fertilizer, essentially. So anyway, there's a lot of good information here. A lot of these legume cover crops are really good at fixing nitrogen, but hairy vetch, very slow to grow, not a good nitrogen scavenger. It doesn't need to scavenge for nitrogen because it's going to make its own. Red clover, very slow to grow. White clover, same boat. So this quick growth window is really about how quickly is a cover crop going to germinate and be able to outcompete weeds. And because legumes don't do a good job of that, that's one reason that we'll often mix these. So we'll have one species of legume and one grass species, so we can kind of maximize our benefits between those two. So the grass will come up quick, outcompete weeds, it will scavenge for existing nitrogen, and the legume will fix additional nitrogen for the future crop. This is what a really healthy system looks like. So these are the roots of a legume, and these little balls, they look like a disease like root knot nematode or something, but these are all nodules. And how you can tell things are really working and being effective, you can take your fingernail and pinch, they're like kind of cut one of those nodules in two, and you should see that they're really bright pink and vibrant in the middle. So this is really well inoculated. There's a lot of nodules on here, and you can tell that there's a lot of nitrogen being fixed on this root system. I'm generally not a huge fan of kind of like microbiological additives to our soils and the soil system, but when it comes to legumes and trying to get the most bang for your buck out of fixing nitrogen from a legume cover crop, buying the appropriate inoculant, so that bacteria that is working symbiotically with the cover crop, when you buy that inoculant and put it on your legume cover crop seed, it really does make a huge difference and kind of kickstarts those plants' ability to fix nitrogen, especially if it's a field that hasn't had a lot of legumes in it in the past. And the best time to terminate a legume cover crop to get the most nitrogen out of it is right before, right as it's starting to set pods. So this hairy vetch, we've got a nice blossoms set. And when you start to see, you know, most of these clusters of blossoms, the bottom 2 or 3 have little legume or have little pods, like pea pods on them. Oh, when you start to see that, that's when the roots are really maximizing their nitrogen fixation. Once you start to go towards like seed formation in the so you're more developed, then the seeds are actually taking that nitrogen and putting them up into the seed, and you're kind of you're losing your benefit at that point. So pre-pod set's the best time to terminate your legumes for your maximizing your nitrogen fixation.
Jason, there's
Yeah.
a question. When is the best time to terminate your winter rye and vetch? Does using tarp to break it down helps?
So I'm just going to move into the rye and vetch part. And tarps are a great tool for termination. So without a tool like tarps, you need you know, a heavy mower, you need heavy cultivation equipment to incorporate that residue into the soil. With a tarp, you can roll that down and put the tarp over it. You know, it's probably the end of June or the middle of June when you get to that, maybe a little earlier. And then you leave it there for 2 weeks or so, and the heat and the lack of light will kill that, and you can have a mulch on the surface. I'm not familiar with too much research on how that approach, leaving the majority of the above ground biomass on the surface as a no-till kind of mulch, how that influences the nutrient dynamics. So that's a interesting like future research question that that still needs to be answered, but it does work well to terminate them. Okay. So any other questions, B? All right. So if we just had a nice thick stand of winter rye, so this here is 5.5 or 6 feet tall. And some of the benefits we're going to get out of that are erosion prevention, nutrient scavenging. It's going to support our soil life. It's going to suppress weeds, and it's going to give us some good soil structure development. Let's see, if we add hairy vetch, then we get all those benefits from the rye, but now we have a pollinator food source. We're fixing nitrogen, and we're balancing our carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is going to prevent nitrogen tie-up. So this is going to get at that like appropriate timing for terminating these. And again, I'll say, when you try to plant just hairy vetch by itself, it can be not quite as winter hardy and slow to germinate, not quite as good at controlling weeds. So we can see a lot of shepherd's purse in these plantings that are just hairy vetch. So combining them, you get a lot of added benefits. Okay, the next science lesson for the evening. So carbon to nitrogen ratio. So when we think about things like wheat straw, like oat straw or corn stover, or you know, to take it to the extreme, like wood chips and wood shavings, especially, that is like pure carbon, and there's not really any nitrogen in something like wood shavings. Things like hairy vetch cover crop residue and just soil microbes themselves, that's a lot of nitrogen and not a lot of carbon. If we dump a lot of carbon into the soil all at once, it creates like a feeding frenzy for the microbes in the soil, and they go crazy and they feed on all that carbon, and in the process they consume any nitrogen that might be in the soil as well, and they tie that up. When the nitrogen's in the bodies of these microbes, it's not available to our plants. So I'm not sure if, hopefully nobody here has put wood shavings down on your garden bed or like turned it in, because when you come back that like 2 months later, your plants will be all yellowed out and look really unhappy. And that's because that nitrogen is not available to them. So even though it's in the soil, it's in a form that's unavailable. So if we went in and we turned in a rye cover crop that was mature, like this one, we're gonna have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 37:1. So there's way too much carbon there, and we're gonna get this nitrogen tie-up effect. If we terminate and turn in that rye cover crop before it starts to head out, so it's still mostly just leafy vegetation, it actually will still add a decent amount of nitrogen to the soil, and it has very little effect on nitrogen tie-up. And I work with some vegetable farmers who they just don't want to have to deal with all that biomass, and they want to get into the farm and onto the fields a lot earlier. So when that's just greening up and it's only, maybe 12 inches tall, they turn it in at that point, and they have pretty good luck with that. So they're not getting their maximum benefits out of it, but it's avoiding like nitrogen tie-up and the process of having to incorporate that back into the soil. If we had just hairy vetch alone, we'd have a big blast of nitrogen available to the crops all at once. There would be no tie-up at all if that's all that we were turning into the soil. Okay, so there's a lot here. So this is looking at the cover crop itself and kind of the dry matter, the growth stage of that cover crop, how much was allowed to grow or be in the field with the biomass. And then I guess lastly, kind of the important thing is how much plant available nitrogen was there in the field. So again, we see the common vetch itself was killed when it was vegetative, just starting to form pods. And that made for 50 pounds of plant available nitrogen. So 50 pounds of plant available nitrogen is a lot of fertilizer. That's like half of the fertilizer that you need in a season. So in doing this, you could cut your nitrogen budget completely in half. So that's pretty impactful. If they just had cereal rye and they got it when it was still pretty vegetative, they got 20 pounds of nitrogen that was made available to their plants. And when they waited until it was big and mature and heading, 8,000 pounds per acre is a lot of biomass. They actually had the equivalent of negative 27 pounds. So not only did they have to apply their 100 to 140 pounds per acre of nitrogen, but they had to add an additional 25 or 30 on top of that because so much of it got tied up.
Jason,
Yeah.
pause a little bit. What about wood stove ash? And also, Hannah Hamilton mentioned we have gotten yellow out plants from using unfinished potting soils that had too much woody stuff in there.
Yeah. So, it's been a long day. So the second one that you just said, yeah, unfinished compost and potting media, that can be some carbon and nitrogen issues. It can also be that there's ammonia So that gaseous form of nitrogen that is being released. That's one of the biggest risk of using unfinished compost is that it has been taken out of the pile. It's had a lot of oxygen put to it, but because it hadn't finished its process yet, it's going to gas off, and that nitrogen in a gaseous form hurts your plants. So we don't want that, obviously. B, can you remind me of the first question?
What about wood stove ash?
Yeah. So wood ash has a bigger influence on your pH. So you want to think of wood ash like the same that you do lime to adjust your pH. The benefit of wood ash is that it also has potassium in it, and so you can think of all that beneficially. I suppose if there's a lot of like the black pieces of charcoal in it, you could have some carbon issues with that, but I'm not quite as concerned with that. Although, well, it could definitely cause issues. So you might want to screen it, take some of that charcoal out, um, and but generally think of it more as a lime type material. And you can, and also keep in mind that you can go too far with that. So just like, you should only put on enough lime to get into this middle range. So if you put your wood ash in the same spot of your garden every winter, you could have a pH that's way too high. So be cautious of that. So this study was just looking at individual species, so just vetch or just rye grown to different development stages. Here we're looking at how long it was allowed to grow and the mixture of legume to cereal. And cereal is the winter rye, and the legume is hairy vetch. So we see when there's a higher percentage of legume in that mix, that can really go up quickly. But here, I should have had an image of what these are referring to, but joint is when the shoot is starting to come up out of the rye, that main stem versus just the leafy parts. And boot is when right before the actual like grains and anthers kind of come out. So as it's getting more mature, it's getting taller. We're into the middle of May. We're just continuously losing our plant available nitrogen with just rye. The 25% of the legume keeps it pretty neutral into later in the season. And if we go higher with the percentage of legume, we can actually have more plant available nitrogen in that system. So there's a lot of ways, depending on your goals, that you can adjust your seeding rates to have a higher or lower ratio of nitrogen or of legumes to cereals. So just to kind of summarize that, in the process of trying to avoid nitrogen tie-up and make nitrogen as available as possible, we want to mix our fast-growing grass species with a legume to maximize those benefits. We want to try to maybe terminate those a little bit on the earlier side to also reduce the amount of carbon that's being dumped into the soil. And to try to get the release of those nutrients to coincide with when our vegetables are growing or our crops, whatever the crop is. So generally, having these legumes and cover crop and grasses mixed together, that means that the release rate of the nitrogen gets slowed down, and it will be made more available just as your crops are starting to really actively grow, maybe 3 or 4 weeks after you put them out into the field. So some different options for kind of having these mixes of grasses and hairy vetch. in the fall time. So planting in like September, hairy vetch and winter rye are a really good option, and they will overwinter and survive in the springtime. If you don't have a good way to kill these, you need to be very careful, because if they go to seed, especially if hairy vetch goes to seed, it can become a problem for a very long time. It will become a weed. But if you have a way to terminate those, planting the vetch at like 25 pounds per acre and the rye at about 50, 55, that's a much, usually if you plant a rye by itself, you could have almost 150 pounds per acre that you put out. So much fewer on the grasses and the full rate for the vetch. If you wanted something that was going to winter kill, so if you're on a smaller scale, you have less equipment, you can do field peas and oats. Those will give you some good benefits, but they will winter kill, so you don't have to deal with them in the springtime. If you have plots of your garden that you're going to set aside for the middle of the season, so let's say you have a field or you have a few beds in the garden that you want to just recuperate and bring back, cowpeas and pearl millet would be a good option. These really like warm weather. They grow really aggressively. You can get a lot of biomass, a lot of growth off of both of those. 50 pounds of cowpeas and 14 of the millet per acre. And the option that we're using for our inner seeding, where we're seeding over the cabbages, is crimson clover and annual ryegrass. And those can be planted kind of anytime in the summer. We're planting them into August and getting good growth. And they don't put on as much biomass, so they don't compete with the cabbage crop quite as aggressively as a pearl millet would. And they're also easier to deal with as far as equipment to get those incorporated. Annual ryegrass can be a little tricky to kill, but if you're gonna run a tiller or a disc harrow through the field maybe 2 or 3 times, separated by a few days each time, you can get that terminated. So there's some pretty good resources out there. There's Oregon State University has one of the options for how to actually calculate how much plant available nitrogen you're getting from your cover crops. And it's a fairly involved process. You're going to go out and take a little, what is it, 19-inch by 19-inch quadrant and cut all the plant at the base and send it off to the lab for analysis and weigh it, dry weigh it. So a lot of growers probably aren't going to go through that process, but I just am kind of putting this up here to stress that using cover crops in the right way definitely do give you a nitrogen credit in the same way that a fertilizer application would do it. And a lot of farmers are really hesitant to pull back on their fertilizer application amounts. And through doing some exercises like this, you can kind of see that, okay, we are getting that amount of nitrogen, like we can be more confident in cutting back on our fertilizer bill. So if anybody, especially any Maine growers, are interested in just playing around and running some of these tests, I'm happy to talk with you and maybe come out to the farm and talk more about how that can be done. So there are kind of a lot of factors involved in what that credit might look like, and also how quickly it's made available. But soil moisture and temperature. So if you incorporate a cover crop just at the right time and it's just the right mix and everything went just right, but then we have a drought and the soils get really dry, the microbial life in the soil isn't going to break those down as quickly as we'd like. So stuff like soil moisture and cool temperatures can also have that effect. That again, that cover crop species and then the timing of when we terminate them. And so we're trying to line all these factors up with with that release rate and when we're going to need the big flush of fertilizer in the field. So let's see, late vegetative growth stage. So we looked at the total, or in this study, they looked at the total amount of nitrogen that was made available by these different legume cover crops. Here they terminated them at late vegetative growth stage. In this table, they terminated them late, so they were flowering. So the peas gave almost 80 pounds of nitrogen that was available. When they tested them 4 weeks and then 10 weeks after incorporating them, we saw that they got 40 pounds of nitrogen, plant available nitrogen, that was in those fields. Vetch was pretty similar. Oats was, it kind of tied up just a little bit, but then 10 weeks down the road, there was more release from that. So that carbon from the oats, as that broke down, it released more cover crop, or sorry, more nitrogen. And then we can just see that when those were all terminated a little bit later at the flowering stage, we had just a little bit less nitrogen that was made available. Well, in this case, it was almost half. And we had much more tie-up of our grass species early, and then that slowly became available over time. So, this is kind of showing us that if we have a big winter rye, or we take a bunch of wood shavings and we dump it into the soil, and then you go out 3 weeks later and you freak out because everything is yellow and it looks like, everything is going to die, and you just have some reassurance that you haven't completely destroyed your soils, that and that it isn't the end of the line for that crop, because like I said, all those microbes are coming out, they're feeding on all the nitrogen in the soil, but they're going to slowly die off. And as they die, they're re-releasing that nitrogen into the soil. So the nitrogen isn't lost, it's just tied up for a short period of time. And usually that's 3 to 6 weeks. And now so this is just showing that the same thing happens with manure. When we apply manure, we don't get the full amount of nutrients that's available in those. In year 1, we get 55% on average of the nitrogen that's in that poultry. The rest is bound up in the organic matter. When we come back next year, we can give ourselves a credit. So let's say that this is 2023. So last year we got 55 pounds of nitrogen from this manure. Here we got in 2024, we'll expect to get 12 years from what we applied, 12 pounds from what we applied last year. And then next year in 2025, we'll still get 5 pounds of nitrogen that's released from our 2023 manure application. So the same thing is happening with our cover crops. We get a big blast up front, but all that organic matter is holding on to nutrients and it's slowly releasing them down the road. So same thing, if we use those same kind of decay factors with our pea cover crop, we could get 40 pounds in year 1, and then 10 pounds in year 2, and then 4 pounds of credit down the road. Okay. So it might seem like a big gamble to go out and say, well, that cover crop looked really great. I like the timing that we terminated it at. So we're going to cut back on the fertilizer that we put in. And we're going to give ourselves 40 pounds of nitrogen credit for that hairy vetch that was there. That doesn't have to be your decision for the year. That can be your upfront decision. and you can use a test called the pre-sidrous nitrate test to figure out what's in the soil just before your crops start to grow rapidly. And this is just a soil test, just like you take to determine your phosphorus and potassium and pH of the soil. This test, you take cores that go 12 inches down, and what they're testing for is only nitrate. And actually in Maine, we do nitrate and ammonium, so it's available nitrogen. And most of our vegetable crops, and this test was initially created for corn and corn silage crops. But what we're looking for is somewhere between 25 and 30 parts per million of nitrate. And if you're below that, this is a very quick turnaround test. So you take it 3 weeks after you transplant. They get the results back to you in 2 or 3 days. And then at that point, you can decide, do I need to add more fertilizer, or are we good with the plan that we initially started with? So this is a really good option for folks that are a little nervous about taking credit for the cover crop and not putting so much fertilizer down up front. This is kind of a way to check how you're doing and if you made those right assumptions. Yeah, and the lab will give you these recommendations. If you're below 25 parts per million, you should apply like a full side dress amount of nitrogen. And if you're above 30, you don't need any at all. So a lot of things that seem very magical and mysterious through all of this process. A lot of it's happening underground, hard to see. So I just wanted to kind of, highlight that this is all part of a living system, and we really need to focus on make sure we have as good and as healthy of a cover crop as possible. So the more growth of cover crop that we have, then the more that those cover crops are able to give us those benefits. So in the same way that we're expecting the cover crops to fertilize the soils for us, we also in some cases need to think about fertilizing the soil for the cover crops. Because if you have, I've done this where we put oats or whatever type of cover crop out in a really tired field, and those oats get, 12 inches tall maybe, and they're yellow, and there's just as many weeds as our oats because they don't have the fertility that they need to grow. So in this trial, they fertilized just like a standard fertility rate, and it was actually cut down. So it was, I should know this, but it was probably 60 or 70 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and then cover cropped over that, and we can see the growth rate. This is how much biomass, how much those cover crops grew. We're more than 4 times of the biomass in the areas that were fertilized versus those that weren't fertilized, and that's across the map for each of these different cover crop species that was grown. So again, if you only have this little sliver of like very small amount of annual ryegrass or cereal rye growth, you're not going to get any benefit out of that. So and again, there's work that came out of this team that showed that 80% of those nutrients that they put down were carried over for the next crop, particularly in overwintered cover crops, or if it was a mid-season cover crop where they grew Sudan grass and then put a fall crop in after it. Okay, so to kind of wrap up all of that, so when I initially created this this presentation, fertilizer was selling at $6 per unit of nitrogen. and I think it's still up close to that depending on your source. So that can make cover crop seed look pretty cheap if you're going to get a similar benefit out of it. So we need to keep in mind that enhancing our soil health helps to hold nutrients in the soil long term, and maintaining living roots ensures that any excess nutrients that are there at the end of the season get soaked up and carried over for the next year. We need to keep in mind that it's a good idea to strategically mix our nutrient capturing cover crops like grasses with nitrogen fixing cover crops to maximize the benefit that we're getting. And we want to feed our cover crops to maximize all those benefits. And if you aren't sure if you're giving yourself a credit, you aren't totally positive about it, that pre-sidedrous nitrate test is a good way to determine if you played your cards right, and at that point you can go add more fertilizer if you need to. And doing this over multiple seasons too, you can start to say, figure out like, well, I did it this way last year and everything worked out pretty well. And you can kind of hone in on your system, like what needs to be changed. So I'll give just kind of one more pitch before we open it up for questions. This is kind of the feed out from the Northeast Cover Crop Council's cover crop species selector tool. And then here I entered 3 benefits that we were trying to achieve. Goal number 1, I think was, no, I lost them, but I think it was like weed prevention, nutrient capture, and then nitrogen fixation. So here we can see, here's a good window when we can plant this species of winter rye. Winter rye is really good at weed suppression, really good at nutrient capture, but it doesn't fix any nitrogen. And then we can see for our soil type and for the window that's available that red clover fixes nitrogen really well and might be a good option to mix with that. So it's a good place to just kind of get the wheels spinning and to learn a lot more about each of these species, because when you click on these, it gives you a whole list of information about seeding rate and ability to overwinter in different hardiness zones and all sorts of good stuff.
There's 2 questions.
Okay.
I've read that some species families of cover crop can host certain pests and disease. Do you think that this is a concern in the Northeast, and any warning you have to give?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually am just starting to draft out a fact sheet about that topic because it is absolutely a concern. For vegetable producers, most vegetable systems have a lot of brassicas that they're planting as cash crops. So the idea of planting tillage radish, oilseed radish, these purple top turnips as a cover crop makes them very nervous because that could just host more flea beetles, more black rot. There's a lot of diseases that could be carried over. I haven't seen too many examples of that, and generally flea beetles die down by the fall time, but it is absolutely a concern. Another big concern is if you have sclerotinia or white rot. So if you see like tomatoes on the ground and they're all white and fuzzy, and then pumpkins that as they're still growing can get that issue. A lot of our non-grass cover crop species are also hosts for that. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind. If you have specific pests that you're currently dealing with, I'd be happy to chat about cover crops that might be good to fight against those. But there's also a lot that could be hosts that you would want to avoid.
So in the potato world, we're trying to avoid some of the clover because they could carry verticilliums and rhizotactia into the potato later. So something to keep in mind. Another question, does taking mustard as a cover crop at the end of summer help as a soil antiseptic? Basically, if there's a disease in the area, would mustard help fight it?
Yeah, so there's the idea of biofumigation. And there are certain species of mustards. So one of the big ones is Caliente 199. That's like the variety. And that has a higher level of what we call glucosinates. So it's these, it's like what makes mustard gas. And what you want to do is grow that out until it's fairly mature. Take a flail mower and chop that up as fine as you can. Till it into the soil, and then either run over it with a cultipacker or like a lawn roller, or best case scenario is that you put a tarp over it and try to keep those gases in as soon as you incorporate, and that's going to act like a fumigant, and there is some evidence that it is beneficial to knock back some soil-borne diseases.
Do you know anything about the Kodiak mustard?
Sorry, I'm gonna open my voice up for this one because I'm the one asking the question.
Yep.
So yeah, we had some diseases in our cantaloupe house this summer, and so we grew mustard at the end of the summer, and as you said, we grew it up. We then we tarped it, then we tilled it in, but then we also afterwards grew winter rye and vetch to hopefully be able to use the nutrients through that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, no, that sounds like a good approach. I'm not familiar with Kodiak. I have seen some lists around of like the top 3, and
It's a high glucosinate.
okay.
I don't know, not sure if I'm saying that.
Yeah. Well, if that's the case, then yeah, that is beneficial. The fact that you tarped it and left it on top might not have gotten all of the benefit out of it, because it's really about chopping it up and getting it into the soil, but it still would have had some benefit. And then it would also depended on what diseases were bothering your melon crop.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is buckwheat a good option?
Buckwheat's a good option as a cover crop, but it's really more so of a short season, warm season cover crop, and it germinates very quickly. It's really good for outcompeting weeds, but it's not known for capturing nutrients, and it's not known for having much positive influence on soil health and like organic matter, because it's so juicy and succulent that it just kind of melts away once you kill it.
Any experience with borage to improve soil health? BORAGE?
Yep, I've grown borage, but not specifically as a cover crop. I do work with one producer who grows a lot of Brussels sprouts, and he has a lot of aphids in those sprouts. So he does one bed every 75 feet at least, that he just does direct seeded alyssum, phacelia, and it wouldn't surprise me if there was some borage in that mix. So these have really kind of tight flower pods, and they are great at being a host site, like a home for beneficial insects. So he has a lot of like hoverflies and lacewing moth that come in, and then they go out into the Brussels sprouts and keep those aphids under control. And it's really surprising how effective that is.
Spring wheat for grain, interseed crimson clover for weed control at seeding. Problem with that?
Say it one more time.
Spring wheat for grain,
Mhm.
interseed with crimson clover for weed control at seeding. Problem with that?
At seeding. So you'd plant that in the fall time, right? And feel free to unmute yourself, whoever.
No, it's a spring wheat.
Oh, spring wheat, not winter. Okay. B, you probably have more experience with this than me. Do you?
We up here we don't intercede. It will help, and I know in the Midwest they do that for weed control as well. It depends on your row spacings.
Yeah.
But at seeding, then you might also have a competition with nutrient scavengers.
Yep. I saw some fields in Linnaeus this spring that had some clover through the stubble of whatever the crop was. So I have seen that. And I've seen folks maybe stagger the timing where you plant the grain and then come back through and overseed, but that's more so if it's a fall seeded like winter grain. So a spring grain, I think that you could. So the thing that we're trying to achieve with interseeding in vegetables, especially in the sweet corn, is that we're waiting until 21 to 30 days after the corn has been growing, and it's like knee height. And then we put the cover crop seed out and scratch it in so there's a little soil on top and try to get it just germinated before the corn totally shades out the soil. And if there's no light getting down to the soil, that cover crop just kind of goes dormant. And if it's only 3 inches tall, it's not going to be competing against the cash crop for nutrients and water. So that works really well, and you can look through and say, oh man, this really wasn't effective. And then in late September, you come through and you mow that corn off, and within a week, it really takes off. So it's pretty cool to watch.
So that was my question. So that sounds like it might be a good option if you've just got wheat stubble going through the winter, because you've got your cover crop there.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's the idea of frost seeding too, which actually frost seeding might not work as well if there's stubble in the field, because the action that you're looking for is the ability of the soil to crack and contract as it freezes and thaws. And if there's stubble there, the root mass could keep that soil kind of in place so that the seed doesn't fall down into the soil. But it could also have enough coverage from the stubble that's there. So I don't know, something worth trying out on a small plot, maybe.
So I can't prove this. Somebody is saying I can't prove this, but I swear cover crop helps with pests in general and also late blight in tomatoes. Does anyone else have this experience? This is from the Elizabeth Marks from the NRCS Soil Health Specialist.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely more microbial life. So as far like soil microbial life, so as far as Phytophthora and some of the soil-borne diseases, there's more competition there, so they're less likely to really fully take hold. Things like late blight are airborne, and like if they're going to show up, they're kind of going to show up. So I wouldn't bank my late blight control on my cover cropping, but it absolutely is beneficial for reducing those. Also, healthier soils are less likely to splash, or you might have more mulches and residue on top of the soil. So if there's less soil splashing, there's less transfer of disease spores up onto your crop.
If that works, I'm pretty sure the potato growers in the county is going to try that.
Right.
If you plant borage once and let it go to seed, you can expect it forever. Amazing insect plant though.
Yeah. I have some like along my deck in like a little bit of a wild spot of our garden, and it is nice that it keeps coming back for free, but I wouldn't want it in a production zone necessarily unless I was really paying attention to it.
So last one, any benefit you have seen to cover crop in rows of fruit trees for weed suppressions? We are worried about competition.
So planting under
the fruit trees.
Under fruit trees makes me a little nervous, but if the alternative is just straight up uncontrolled weeds, then having a low-lying Dutch white clover would be a legume that grows slowly and it grows low. So the thing about Dutch white clover is that it has runners. It runs sideways really quickly, but it does fill in. It fills in like blank areas, so in any bare soil. Ideally, I would think I would go with like an intentional like fescue and red clover. The red clover is going to run less, and I do that in the drive row between rows, and then try to do some mulching in between. But if the alternative is weeds or a cover crop, I'd put a Dutch white clover under my fruit trees. Again, that legume, we saw in that table, it's not good at capturing nitrogen, meaning that it's not going to take so much nitrogen away from your crop and out of the soil already. It's actually going to be doing more feeding nitrogen back to the soil. With our interseeding, we're doing some species selection, and all of the species that we're testing are mixes of grasses and legumes, because we saw in some past work by other teams that that there was much less drag and much less concern for nutrients if there's a legume in there, or if it's a legume by itself. And that's with vegetables, and vegetables are going to be much more sensitive to that than tree fruits.
So I have two comments to make. One is for potato, we're trying to not plant any grain or grass type as a rotation, because wireworm can be that carried over. If you have that pest issue, you might want to rotate something else. The second one, to answer your nitrogen questions, why we don't test nitrogen for a lot of reasons. I assume the soil test you show is a fall season soil sample.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for fall, it's hard to determine how much is gonna left for your next crop, right? Depends on what you want to grow. And a lot of row crops are planting by yield potential, or so how much nitrogen they need is, let's say corn. They probably 1 pound of nitrogen equals to 1 bushel of corn. So they are using their average yields to determine the nitrogen. And a lot of growing seasons crops, you determine nitrogen during the growing season. So paleo sample for potatoes, PSNT for corns, and vegetable also have PSNT. And I guess that's maybe why. And nitrogen leach out easily, especially in Maine. So, determine how much you have in the fall is not necessarily feasible for your spring crop.
Yep. Perfect. Well, man, we did pretty good on time. Well, I definitely appreciate everybody coming out. Feel free to give us a call if you have any questions or you want to talk through any of these systems. I do a lot of work with particularly with vegetable growers, but with everybody on looking at your crop rotation plan and fitting in the cover crops and picking what species might go in there. So be happy to talk cover crops with anybody. Also keep an eye out. Tomorrow we'll be sending an evaluation out, and that is really important to and helpful for us to figure out what we're doing well and what we can improve on, and it helps us to justify our jobs and us being here. So but again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight, and thanks a bunch to B for helping me with the tech side.